You've been pushing, forcing, grinding through every day like life is a wall you have to break through with sheer willpower. And maybe it's worked in bursts. Maybe you've muscled your way into achievements that looked impressive from the outside. But something underneath never settled. Because no matter how hard you pushed, it always felt like you were swimming against a current that shouldn't be there. Like the very thing you were working toward kept sliding just out of reach. And the exhaustion wasn't normal tiredness. It was the bone-deep fatigue of a person whose entire way of operating is fundamentally misaligned with the life they're trying to build. Carl Jung saw people destroy themselves this way, not through laziness, not through lack of ambition, through a specific kind of effort that looked productive on the surface, but was actually the ego dragging the whole person in a direction their deeper nature never agreed to go. And what he discovered about the people whose lives eventually did start working, where opportunities appeared, relationships deepened, and things began falling into place with an ease that almost felt suspicious, wasn't that they tried harder. It was that they changed something fundamental about how they moved through the world. Something most people never think to change because they've been told their entire lives that the answer is always more effort, more discipline, more control. Today I'm going to show you what Jung found actually shifts when life starts cooperating instead of resisting. Why the way most people pursue their goals almost guarantees those goals will keep retreating, and the specific psychological realignment that Jung observed in every person whose life began working in their favor. This isn't about manifesting. It isn't about positive thinking. It's about understanding a mechanism in your own psyche that's been working against you, and learning to stop fighting it. Jung noticed something that disturbed him early in his career. Patients who were doing everything right, working hard, making responsible choices, following the path they were told would lead to fulfillment, were some of the most miserable people he'd ever encountered. They had careers, relationships, status. They'd achieved what society told them to achieve, and they sat in his office hollow, anxious, depressed, wondering why success felt like wearing someone else's life. Meanwhile, he observed another group, people who'd gone through periods of complete upheaval, who'd abandoned the expected path, who'd made choices that looked reckless or irresponsible to everyone around them. And these people, not all of them, but a specific subset, had arrived at something the first group couldn't access no matter how hard they worked. A quality of life that wasn't about external achievement, it was about alignment. Everything they did seemed to connect to everything else. Opportunities appeared that they hadn't manufactured. Relationships formed that felt natural rather than transactional. Their effort produced results disproportionate to the energy they invested. Jung didn't attribute this to luck or privilege. He recognized a psychological pattern. The people whose lives were working had undergone a specific internal shift, and the people whose lives felt like constant uphill struggle hadn't. The difference wasn't effort, it was orientation, the direction from which their effort originated. To understand what Jung meant, you need to see what he saw about the two centers of the human psyche. Most people operate exclusively from the ego. The ego is the part of you that plans, strategizes, worries, compares, and controls. It's the voice that says, I need to achieve this, I need to become that, I need to prove I'm enough. The ego isn't evil, it's necessary. But Jung found that the ego, left to run the entire show, makes catastrophic choices about direction. Because the ego doesn't know who you actually are, it only knows who you've been told you should be. The ego builds its entire strategy from external data, what your parents valued, what your culture rewards, what your peer group respects, what will make you look successful, attractive, worthy. And it pursues these things with genuine intensity. But the direction it chooses is almost always borrowed. It's not coming from your actual nature. It's coming from a composite of every expectation, comparison, and fear you've absorbed since childhood. This is why achievement so often feels empty. You reached the goal and felt nothing, because the goal was never yours. It was the ego's interpretation of what would make you acceptable. And now you're standing at the top of a mountain you never actually wanted to climb, wondering why the view doesn't move you. Jung identified the other center, what he called the self. Not the self with a lowercase s, which is just your everyday identity. The self with a capital S. The totality of who you are, including everything the ego has rejected, suppressed, and denied. The self holds your actual nature, your genuine direction, the life that would feel like yours if you could access it. And it's been sending signals your entire life. Signals the ego has been overriding because they don't match the plan. Those signals show up as restlessness, as the feeling that something is off even when everything looks fine, as the persistent pull toward things that don't make sense on your ego's spreadsheet, as the depression that descends when you're succeeding by everyone else's standards, but failing by some internal measure you can't articulate. Jung recognized all of these as the self trying to redirect a person who's been hijacked by the ego's agenda. Here's what makes this so difficult. The ego's agenda feels like your agenda. You've been identified with it so completely that when the self sends a competing signal, leave this career, end this relationship, stop performing this version of yourself, it feels like self-destruction. It feels like throwing away everything you've built, because the ego has convinced you that what it built is who you are. And letting any of it go feels like dying. But Jung observed that the people whose lives started working had all gone through a version of this death. They'd reached a point where the ego's agenda became so painful, so hollow, so obviously misaligned with their actual nature that they couldn't sustain it anymore. And in the collapse of the ego's plan, something else emerged: the self's direction. Quieter than the ego's demands, less dramatic, but accurate in a way the ego never was. This is the shift Jung documented, not from passivity to action, not from failure to success, from ego-driven effort to self-aligned movement. And when he watched people make this shift, he observed something that looked almost mystical, but was actually psychological. Their lives began cooperating. What does that mean practically? It means the grinding stopped. Not effort itself. They still worked, still created, still engaged with life fully. But the quality of effort changed. It stopped feeling like pushing a boulder uphill and started feeling like moving with a current. Decisions became clearer because they were checking with something deeper than the ego's anxiety. Opportunities appeared because they were oriented toward what was actually theirs, instead of what the ego thought they should want. Relationships improved because they stopped performing an identity and started inhabiting their actual one. People could feel the difference even if they couldn't name it. Jung would have called this individuation in action. Not individuation as an abstract concept, but as a lived shift in how a person moves through the world. The individuated person doesn't stop trying. They stop trying to be someone they're not. They stop forcing outcomes that don't belong to them. They stop investing massive energy into maintaining a direction their deeper nature never endorsed. And that recovered energy, all that force that was going into fighting yourself, becomes available for actual living. But here's where most people get stuck. They hear align with your true self, and they think it means sitting in meditation until clarity descends. Or they think it means abandoning all responsibility and following every whim. Or they think it means waiting passively until the universe delivers what they want. None of that is what Jung meant. And all of it is the ego trying to co-opt the process by turning it into another strategy for getting what it wants. The actual shift Jung described requires something much harder than any of those. It requires confronting why you've been living from the ego's agenda in the first place, and that confrontation leads directly to the shadow. Your shadow contains everything you've rejected about yourself in order to be acceptable. The anger you suppressed because you were told good people don't get angry. The ambition you buried because it felt selfish. The grief you refused to feel because it was inconvenient. The parts of you that didn't match the identity your family, culture, or relationships required. All of that got pushed into the shadow, and it didn't disappear. It became the invisible force working against every plan your ego constructed. This is why life feels like it's fighting you. It's not the universe conspiring against you. It's your own shadow sabotaging every ego-driven effort because the shadow contains the truth the ego is trying to outrun. You suppress your anger, and it shows up as passive aggression that destroys your relationships. You deny your real desires, and you self-sabotage every time you get close to the false goals you've been chasing. You reject parts of yourself, and those parts become the exact obstacles you keep running into. Jung found that this is the mechanism most people never see. They think they need to work harder, strategize better, discipline themselves more. But the problem was never insufficient effort. The problem was that half their psyche was working in one direction, while the other half was pulling them back. You can't outwork an internal war. You can only resolve it. And resolving it means shadow integration, bringing back the rejected parts, acknowledging the anger, the desire, the grief, the ambition, the darkness that didn't fit the ego's polished self-image. Not acting on every impulse. Jung was clear about that. But owning what's actually inside you instead of pretending it isn't there. Because every part of yourself you deny becomes a source of resistance, and every part you reclaim becomes available energy. This is why people who've done genuine shadow work seem to have more energy than everyone around them. They're not superhuman. They've just stopped spending 70% of their psychological fuel suppressing what they don't want to see. That recovered energy becomes power. Not ego power, the kind that forces and controls. Authentic power, the kind that moves with clarity because it's not fighting itself. And this is where something that genuinely fascinates emerges from Jung's observations. When a person integrates enough of their shadow and begins operating from the self rather than the ego alone, something he called synchronicity starts appearing. Meaningful coincidences that can't be explained by cause and effect, but that feel too precise to be random. The right person appears at the right time. Information you needed arrives without you seeking it. Doors open that you didn't know existed. Jung didn't explain synchronicity as magic or manifestation. He described it as what happens when your internal alignment matches the external patterns of your life. When you stop forcing a direction that isn't yours and start moving in the direction that is, you become available to connections and opportunities that were always there, but that your ego-driven tunnel vision couldn't perceive. You weren't unlucky before. You were looking in the wrong direction so intensely that you missed everything arriving from where you weren't willing to look. If you're beginning to recognize that the current you've been swimming against might be your own unexplored nature pulling you towards something more honest, then you're already sensing what Jung spent his career documenting. That there's a deeper direction inside you that knows things the ego doesn't. And if you want to explore that direction further, our guide, True Self-Discovery, offers 24 practical reflection exercises, inspired by Jung's own teachings, designed to help you stop guessing at who you are and start actually finding out. Click below to get it. Now let's go deeper into what this realignment actually looks like in daily life. Because the shift from ego-driven to self-aligned doesn't happen in one dramatic moment. It happens in hundreds of small choices that most people overlook. And these choices look completely different from what the self-improvement industry tells you to do. The first change Jung observed was in how people made decisions. The ego makes decisions through analysis, comparison, and fear. Will this make me look good? What will people think? What's the safest option? What maximizes my advantage? These calculations happen so automatically that most people don't realize they're doing them. Every choice filtered through the ego's surveillance system, checking for threats to its carefully constructed identity. People whose lives started working made decisions differently, not recklessly, not impulsively, but from a place deeper than calculation. They developed what Jung described as a relationship with their own instinct. Not blind instinct, but instinct informed by self-knowledge. They could feel when something was right for them in a way that didn't require external validation, and they trusted that feeling even when it contradicted the ego's analysis. This is terrifying at first, because the ego has been your decision maker your entire life. Letting something else have input feels like losing control, and in a sense, it is. You're loosening the ego's absolute authority over your choices. But what replaces it isn't chaos. It's a more complete form of intelligence, one that includes information the ego can't access, because the ego only works with what it already knows. The self works with what you actually need. The second change was in how people related to other people. The ego manages relationships like a business negotiation. What am I getting? What am I giving? Am I safe? Am I being perceived correctly? Are they a threat? Are they useful? This isn't conscious manipulation. It's the automatic survival programming of an ego that learned relationships are transactional, conditional, and dangerous. People operating from greater self-alignment related differently. They could be present without performing. They could listen without strategizing their response. They could be honest about what they felt without first calculating whether honesty was safe. This changed the quality of every interaction because other people could feel the absence of performance. And that absence, that realness, drew a different quality of connection. Jung noted that relationships built from ego attract other egos. You perform, they perform, and both of you relate to masks while wondering why you feel so alone together. But relationships built from authenticity attract authenticity. When you stop performing, the people who only valued the performance leave, and the people who can actually meet you where you are start appearing. This transition is painful because you lose people, but what you gain is connection that actually nourishes instead of depletes. The third change, and this one surprises people, was in how they related to failure. The ego experiences failure as annihilation. If the plan doesn't work, the ego panics because the plan was the ego's identity. I am my career. I am my relationship. I am my success. When any of those collapse, the ego collapses with it. This is why failure feels like dying, because for the ego, it is. People aligned with the self experienced failure differently. It still hurt. Jung never suggested alignment made life painless. But failure wasn't existential. It was informational. It meant this direction isn't yours, rather than you are worthless. It meant the ego had forced something that didn't fit, rather than you are fundamentally broken. And from that perspective, failure became a correction rather than a catastrophe. It became the current pushing you back toward your actual path after the ego had dragged you off course. This reframe changes everything about how you move through difficulty. If failure means the current is redirecting you, then the worst thing you can do is what the ego demands, which is to push harder in the same direction to prove you're not a failure. That's how people spend decades forcing a life that was never theirs. Not because they're stupid, because their ego can't tolerate the idea that the direction was wrong. Admitting the direction was wrong feels like admitting they were wrong, and the ego will sacrifice your entire life before it admits that. The fourth change Jung observed was the most subtle and the most powerful. People whose lives started working had a different relationship with time. The ego lives in a constant state of urgency. I need to achieve this by this age. I'm behind. I'm running out of time. Everyone else is ahead of me. This urgency isn't about genuine deadlines. It's about the ego's terror of inadequacy. If I don't achieve fast enough, I'll be exposed as not enough. Self-aligned people still acted with purpose. They didn't become passive or dreamy, but the frantic quality disappeared. They could work towards something without the desperate energy that actually repels the very thing you're chasing. There's a quality of desperation in ego-driven effort that other people can feel. Employers sense it. Partners feel it. Opportunities recoil from it. Not because the universe is punishing you, but because desperation communicates, I don't believe this is really mine, so I have to grab it before it escapes. And that energy creates exactly the resistance you're trying to overcome. When you operate from alignment, the desperation dissolves, not because you stop caring about outcomes, because you start trusting that what's actually yours will respond to genuine effort rather than panicked grasping. This trust isn't naive optimism. It's the natural byproduct of being oriented in the right direction. When you're moving toward what's actually meant for you, meaning what matches your real nature rather than your ego's borrowed ambitions, there's a steadiness that replaces the frenzy. And that steadiness is magnetic in ways the ego's urgency never is. Jung brought all of this together under one principle that sounds deceptively simple, but takes most people years to truly understand. Stop trying to become who you think you should be. Start discovering who you already are. The ego's entire project is construction, building an identity, becoming something, achieving your way into worthiness. But the self's direction is the opposite. It's uncovering, removing, stripping away everything that was never yours to reveal what's been underneath all along. This is why the people whose lives started working often went through periods that looked like destruction from the outside. They left careers, they ended relationships, they shed identities, they let go of ambitions they'd carried for decades. To everyone watching, it looked like collapse, but from the inside, it felt like excavation, like clearing away rubble to find solid ground they'd never known was there. And here's what Jung found most remarkable. When people reached that solid ground, when they stopped constructing and started uncovering, life responded. Not because of cosmic law or spiritual principle, because a person aligned with their actual nature makes different choices. Those choices create different patterns. Those patterns attract different circumstances. And those circumstances create a life that feels like it's working in your favor, because for the first time, you're moving with your own current instead of against it. The resistance you've been feeling your entire life isn't proof that you need to try harder. It's information. It's your deeper nature telling you that the direction isn't right, that the identity you're maintaining isn't real, that the goals you're pursuing belong to the ego's fear rather than to your actual self. And every day you override that information with more effort, more discipline, more forcing, is another day spent swimming against a current that's been trying to carry you somewhere better. Jung would tell you that the most courageous thing you can do isn't to push harder, it's to stop. To ask yourself honestly, whose life am I building? Whose goals am I chasing? Whose approval am I pursuing? And if the honest answer is that most of it was inherited, borrowed, or adopted out of fear, then the work isn't more effort in the same direction. The work is finding your actual direction, and then doing something even harder than grinding, trusting it. This doesn't mean life becomes effortless. Jung never promised ease. But there's a profound difference between effort that flows and effort that grinds. Between working hard towards something that's genuinely yours and working hard towards something your ego selected from a catalog of acceptable ambitions. One depletes you. The other feeds you, even when it's difficult. One creates the sensation of swimming against a current. The other feels like the current and your effort are finally moving in the same direction. And that's the shift. Not a technique, not a strategy, not a 5-step plan the ego can execute. A fundamental reorientation from building who you think you should be to discovering who you actually are. From forcing the life you were told to want to uncovering the life that's been waiting underneath. From ego control to self-trust. Jung watched this transformation happen hundreds of times across his career, and every time, the pattern was the same. The person stopped fighting themselves. They integrated what they'd been rejecting. They let go of the direction that was never theirs, and life, as if it had been waiting for permission, began to cooperate. Not perfectly, not magically, but with a quality of flow that the person had never experienced before because they'd never been aligned before. If you're exhausted, not the normal tired that rest fixes, but the deep fatigue that persists no matter how much you sleep, consider the possibility that the exhaustion isn't from working too hard. It's from working against yourself, from maintaining an identity that doesn't fit, from chasing goals that aren't yours, from forcing a direction your deeper nature has been resisting for years. The current you've been fighting isn't your enemy, it's your guide. And the moment you stop swimming against it and let it show you where it's going, that's when everything changes. Not because the world shifts, because you finally stop asking the world to reward a version of you that was never real, and you start showing up as the person you actually are, imperfect, uncurated, honest about your nature, aligned with your own depth. That's what Jung meant. That's what it looks like when life begins to work in your favor. Not the universe bending to your will, you bending toward your own truth, and discovering that the truth was always trying to carry you somewhere you couldn't have planned, somewhere better than the ego's blueprint, somewhere that feels, for the first time, like yours. If you haven't yet, our guide True Self-Discovery walks you through 24 reflection exercises drawn directly from Jung's teachings, practical ways to uncover the nature you've been building over, reclaim what you've been rejecting, and start moving with the current that's been waiting for you to stop fighting it. Click below to get True Self-Discovery.